Hey y'all, welcome to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Samantha Leighanne and I talk about books. So, seeing as it's spooky season and I get the question a lot like what are your favorite horror books? Now, I did do a recommendations video for horror for beginners, and yes, some of my favorite horror books do appear on that list. I will link that in the cards up above in case you are interested. However, today I'm going to be talking about some horror books that are not necessarily for beginners and why they are some of my favorites. So the first book that I'm going to talk about as one of my favorites is going to be The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. I'm not going to rehash the plot. I feel like with the Netflix series that came out, most people do know in general what this book is about. A lot of people didn't like the Netflix series. I personally thought that it was excellent, but that's neither here nor there. This, however, does happen to be one of my favorite horror books for multiple reasons. I feel like this book in general is so influential to so many modern horror books, especially a couple of the ones that I'm going to talk about on this list. You know, it's not a book full of loud horror. Everything is very quiet and everything is very under the surface, and I think that that's one of the reasons that I love it so much. This is the book that really gave me my love for haunted house stories, and I feel like the writing itself is really well done, but this is definitely one of my favorite horror novels of all time. So after talking about that, I also do want to talk about Kill Creek by Scott Thomas, and I don't have a physical copy of that. I read it from my library whenever it was released. And I really kind of got it on a whim. I had seen it on like Twitter and stuff. Definitely became one of my favorite horror books of all time. Again, that is also a haunted house story. It definitely has a lot of elements from Haunting of Hill House, which I think is one of the reasons that I enjoy it so much. The premise of Kill Creek is you have a group of writers that are going to spend the night in this house that they know is haunted. They're going to like live stream it. They're going to do interviews. And each of these writers is like a particular type of writer. So you have your Stephen King type. You have your, I don't know, maybe Ania Ahlborn or Karen Slaughter, something like that. Each of these writers has like a parallel to an actual writer that we know in horror. You know, the plot kind of progresses as they get into the house, and even after they leave the house, you know, things turns out they haven't exactly left. I won't go into too much detail because I feel like it's better going in not really knowing very much, because that's what I did and I really enjoyed it. I think everybody associates their favorites based on how they felt while they were reading it. I happened to be listening to this audiobook while I was on overnights for my job. This was 2 years ago maybe. And it was very quiet. The construction crew had gone on to their lunch break, and so it was me and two of my associates in the store. And I was, you know, listening to this audiobook, and it got to this really intense part of the plot. And this thunderstorm, because it's in the middle of the summer, comes out of nowhere, scared the life out of me. So I think that like the atmosphere in conjunction with the writing, I think that that's one of the reasons that I loved it so much. It definitely scared the life out of me. But I think the story as a whole and the writing is really masterfully done. He actually just released a new book as of the filming of this video called Violet, which I have, and I'm probably actually going to be starting next. I'm really excited about it because I'm seeing amazing reviews, and I feel like he's going to become one of my favorite horror writers. So real excited for that one. Another book that I love that I don't physically have is A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. So this is a possession story on the surface. This is surface level. It's a possession story. There's a lot of elements like from The Exorcist, and it does reference The Exorcist. I have read reviews saying that it's a blatant ripoff of The Exorcist, and I see it as so much more than that. One of the reasons that I love horror so much is because it makes us feel things if you allow it to, and I think that that is one of the reasons that I love Tremblay's writing as much as I do, is because he creates this story with these horrific elements, but it's so much more than that under the surface, and it really makes you think. One of the best things about this particular story is the family unit that it involves, and really the way that he writes those relationships between those family members. Like, I felt that, and that was one of the reasons that I loved it so much, and I think that's why it was so impactful for me in general. So definitely one of my favorites there. Another book that I very much enjoyed is The Hunger by Alma Katsu. And this I actually read shortly after I had finished the nonfiction, The Indifferent Stars Above, which is about the Donner Party. And that is actually what this book involves as well. So In this story, we follow certain members of the Donner Party, and it kind of takes the story of what happened to them and kind of turns it on its head, gives it a much more sinister vibe, gives it a much more supernatural vibe even. One of the things that Alma Katsu does so well in this book is, again, that atmosphere. There was one moment where I remember reading this. I'd read it the night before, and I was sitting downstairs and I was reading it, and because of the overall atmosphere that she wrote, I was coming home from work the next night after I had, gone through and read so much of this. I'm coming home from work, and I happened to have to park across the apartment complex that I was living in at the time, and had to walk across the parking lot in the dark. And one of the things in this book focuses very much on the unseen. You spend a lot of time wondering, what's just beyond the trees. And so I'm walking across the parking lot at night, and I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, I felt like I had to run, and I'm like running upstairs. Like when I get in my house, I'm like running upstairs, because I don't know, it just creeped me out on that level. And that's one of the things that I love so much about that book. To me, anytime I can read a book and like really get creeped out to the point where I'm like, is there anything around? You know what I mean? Like, I feel like those are the most successful horror books. Those are the ones that stick with me, and those are the ones that become my favorite. So another book that I have, but again, it's sitting all the way down here, and I just don't want to destroy my shelves to get it. My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. One of the things that I love so much about this book is it is an ode to the 80s, and that is just, I love that about it. Now, of course, there are some things about it that I didn't exactly love, but for the most part, I felt like it was a very successful novel. It's about two young girls. They both go to this private school, and her best friend gets possessed by a demon, and really how that friendship morphs, and how they kind of come through that together. But it was very nostalgic for the 80s. One of the other things that I loved so much about it is it takes place in Charleston, South Carolina. For those of you that don't know, I am from South Carolina, Charleston being one of my favorite cities. I've got married there. I spend my summers there as well. So it was so awesome to be able to like go through, and he's talking about these settings, and I'm like, I've been there too. Like, I love that whenever I'm able to see that in books. And seeing as I live in South Carolina, there aren't a ton of books set in this particular area, so that aspect of it was really fun. But again, the way that he writes, the dynamic between the two girls, as well as just the general atmosphere of the book. There are a lot of horrific elements, but then there's like this comic relief portion of it. Grady Hendrix is an excellent writer. I think that if you haven't read any of his books, this Horror Store or even We Sold Our Souls, all three of those are really excellent books. I think that he's quickly become one of my favorite horror writers, and I'm really looking forward to anything else that he comes out with. Another one of my favorites is The Devil Crept In by Ania Ahlborn. This particular book I first listened to, and this is another one of those examples where I was so creeped out by it, just because of the general atmosphere and the way that she writes. I did have a couple problems with the characters in the story. There is a child that is in this, one that has a disability, and I didn't love the way that that was handled. However, I think that as a horror book and the horror elements, that this was really spot on. Again, the way that she creates this atmosphere for what is going on in this book is like absolutely just amazing, because again, I'm going to give you context because I love giving context, because I like you to have backstory. We've discussed this. I was helping a store to open in the upstate of South Carolina. From where I lived to that particular location, it's all back roads, and I was having to drive either really early in the morning or later at night. A lot of this particular book takes place in like a wooded area, and so I'm like driving through this wooded area, and just the atmosphere that she creates while writing this book was really creepy. And so it was really effective as I'm like driving through. I'm like, please God, I hope I don't get like a flat tire or something, because number one, I'm in the middle of fucking nowhere. Number two, I'm like, oh my God, something's gonna happen to me, i.e. what's going on in this book. And like, I just really appreciated that. So again, while there were a couple of issues that I had with it, I really loved the atmosphere in general. So it's definitely one of my favorites. Forgive any noise that you hear. So the next book that I'm going to talk about is The Troop by Nick Cutter. I've read 3 Nick Cutter books. This is by far my favorite. I will say that this is a book that is not exactly for the faint of heart. It's pretty fucking gross if you really want to be blunt about it. It follows a Boy Scout troop that is doing, like, you know, the test for like their badges or whatever on this particular little island, and somebody who was part of a government experiment, imagine that, ends up on this island. Think genetically engineered tapeworms, and then the plot kind of progresses from there. So again, not for the faint of heart. There's a lot of really gross stuff that happens. But again, this is a book that kind of follows the same type of formatting that Carrie does. You're getting what's actually happening in the book as it's happening, and then you're also cutting to lab reports and the aftermath and, you know, news reports, classified documents, things like that. That's really kind of filling you in on how they got to where they are and what happened in the aftermath. So you're kind of like putting it all together as you go. I think that the formatting of that is one of the things that made it really successful, but it was pretty horrific. So again, not for the faint of heart, but I definitely really enjoyed it. Another one of my favorites, and this is actually a very recent favorite because I literally just read this, is Rosemarys Baby by Levin. Ira Levin. Let's see if I can actually speak words. So this is, I think that this is actually more well known as a film, which I have never seen. So I didn't really know what to expect going into this. Like I thought that it was about a demon baby, and it was, but there's a lot more to the story than that. So there were definitely some things that I didn't enjoy so much about it. However, again, it's one of those things where you can't read a older work through a modern lens because, you know, it was written in the time that it was written for a reason. Overall, I thought that it was really horrific, definitely a classic horror book. And if you haven't read it, I would recommend it. Next, I'm going to talk about the Hellbound Heart. This is by Clive Barker. I have a love-hate relationship with Clive Barker. He's written some amazing works and then other ones that I did not enjoy so much. So the Hellbound Heart is actually the novella that the Hellraiser horror franchise is based off of. So that's pretty cool. And the first film does stick pretty closely to the novella for the most part. Everything after that, not so much. But this is another book or novella that is not necessarily for the faint of heart. There's a lot of blood, gore, grossness mixed with sex. There's this very thin line between like pleasure and pain that they kind of talk about. Clive Barker is real infamous for being like kind of obsessed with sex. So, you know, that's a thing. Know that going into it. However, seeing as this spawned one of the more well-known horror franchises, I think it's definitely worth a read. I really enjoy it, so. And the last book that I'm going to talk about, and I honestly think that this is currently my favorite horror book of all time, is The Ruins by Scott Smith. So I will say that the formatting of this one, there are no chapters, and that was infuriating to me whenever I was reading it. I'm like, why the fuck are there no chapters? I don't have a stopping point. And I will also say that at the beginning, the way that the characters in this book are written are absolutely infuriating, and so you find yourself really hating them. But as the story progresses and as things kind of, you know, continue to devolve, you don't necessarily feel sympathy for the characters, but you're like, yes, as things begin to happen. Another book that is not at all for the faint of heart. I was reading this at one point and made the mistake of, like, I was on my lunch break, I'm reading it on my lunch break, and I had to put it down because it was pretty gross. If you're not familiar with this particular story, this is another one that was also made into a film, which I have not seen. But if you're unfamiliar with the story, it's a group of college students that are taking a trip down to Mexico. They're visiting some ruins, and they get stuck in those ruins, and things begin to happen from there. So again, the characters are so hateable that it makes for a pretty fast-paced read. It's not super long, but I love this book. I actually want to reread it, but I feel like I need to, like, it's getting to be fall, so like I don't really want to read it in the fall. I feel like this is a really good summer horror because it takes place in the summer. So yeah, but really love this one. You guys have seen me talk about this before. You know how much I love this book. So all right, so those are some of my favorite horror books as you guys just saw. Obviously I kept that one, you know, sans King, and I also didn't include any Joe Hill. There are several Joe Hill books that probably would have made that list, but I kind of wanted to separate those two. I might do a video where I specifically talk about Joe Hill's works. If that's something that you're interested in, comment down below and let me know if that's something that you would like to see. What are your favorite horror books, or do you hate any of the books that I talked about in this particular video? Comment down below and let me know. You can also contact me on Twitter, Goodreads, and Instagram. As always, if you like what you see and you want to see more, you can click thumbs up or hit subscribe if you haven't already. You can also click the little bell doodad to be notified of any uploads that I may put out there. So that's the thing. As always, thank you guys so very much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Bye.